The Conservative leadership debate squared off for their first official election, debate of the race tonight. Their second face-to-face after yesterday's French debate and months of lots of virtual campaigning. So did tonight change anything? It's Thursday. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see you all. So you watched it with me. Well, we didn't all sit in the same room, but you know what I mean. We're all watching it together. I expected it to be a little more heated, to have a little more disagreement, but it didn't in fact do that. What did you make of it, Chantal?
It was, for those of us who watched both debates, it was almost day for night. In French, Erin O'Toole and Peter MacKay went at each other to the point where you could barely make out in some instances what they were trying to say or what they were arguing about. Tonight, it was literally the opposite. I suspect there were different strategies in play in both cases. But I'm not sure that the outcome is very different in the sense that if, as everything indicates, Peter MacKay went in there as the front runner, I don't think either night did any damage to his run.
Last night, Andrew, for people that didn't watch in the French debate, Erin O'Toole was fairly aggressive. And in fact, Peter MacKay called him out at one point saying that he was angry. And clearly tonight there was a different Erin O'Toole. He was much more reserved. Why do you think that change happened? And would that have changed people's perception of him or Peter MacKay?
It may just be the format. Sometimes the rules can affect the way people behave. It may also be that looking at the numbers, they're thinking that approach was not going to get him close. If you look at the body language of both O'Toole and MacKay, you would say MacKay has this in a fairly comfortable shape now. He was on cruise control. And it may be that O'Toole's people said to him, look, you've got to emphasize not just the attacks on him, but your plan. He kept mentioning his plan, his positive vision, et cetera. That the pure kind of punching approach isn't going to make the yards that he needs.
How about you, Althea? What did you make of it?
It's like we're watching debates happening in two different countries, frankly. And in some ways we are. I think what happened yesterday was that you had a very aggressive debate between Peter MacKay and Erin O'Toole, in part because the two other candidates really can't speak French very well. Or in one case, not at all. And you also have neither candidate has a strong base of support. And the dynamic there in the last campaign really revolved around social issues, abortion primarily. And so you had not just Erin O'Toole going after Peter MacKay yesterday, but Mr. MacKay going after Mr. O'Toole. You know, are you pro-choice? Are you pro-life? Why won't you give an answer on this? Today, the non-answer from Erin O'Toole really was about systemic racism. We hardly talked about social issues in this debate on Thursday. Instead, what you had really was a campaign for please rank me number two. How many times did we hear, I agree with Dr. Lewis. I agree with Dr. Lewis. I too agree with Dr. Lewis. And it was extremely muted. There were very few points of divergence between the candidates.
I remember,
if I
yes,
can,
go ahead, Chantal,
If I can just go back to last night, I think part of the strategy, at least on the part of Erin O'Toole, is that he was believed to be going in with the language advantage in French, and Peter MacKay had that shown as a huge weakness. And the aggressivity is one way to unsettle someone who's not really in command of a language. But in the end, it didn't pan out. MacKay's French is still not even Andrew Scheer's level, but it's much improved. And it was good enough that, you know, if the plan was that you show Erin O'Toole to be the only one who could go in a French language debate in an election, and Peter MacKay's not up to it, it failed. But that required more aggressivity, obviously.
I remember after the election, we've had a number of conversations about how the Conservative Party needed to do a rethink about who it wanted to be and what it wanted to be moving forward. And that was the way it was going to grow its tent. That was the way it was going to attract, as Erin O'Toole talked about so many times, urban and suburban voters. Did we hear any of that tonight, or whether there had been any reflection moving in that direction, Andrew, do you think?
Not a whole lot. The one thing that people talked about, particularly after the 2019 election, was their environmental plan. Here you've got Erin O'Toole saying he will scrap the carbon tax, but he will keep a large emitters tax, and he was taken to task for even that by MacKay and some of the other candidates. So not a lot of progress on that front. On issues of sort of reaching out to suburban and urban voters, Central Canadian voters, et cetera, there's lip service talked about it, but not a lot in terms of policy, certainly not tonight.
Although Peter MacKay also, Althea, hinted at the big blue tent, which is something that they've said before, but they need to push those pegs back. And I wonder whether Canadians that may have watched, who aren't Conservative Party members, would have heard anything to make them think about the party in a different way.
Frankly, the most interesting comments on how to expand the tent, because that is the Conservatives' biggest challenge, and that is the only way they're going to win an election, came from Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan, actually. Leslyn Lewis talked about not just reaching out to former or perhaps current members of Maxime Bernier's party, but also members of the Green Party. She talked about the former efforts, frankly, that have been done under Jason Kenney and Stephen Harper to bring new immigrants into the Conservatives family. And I know a lot of Conservative MPs feel that the party has dropped the ball on that. So she talked a lot about that, as well as, people who share similar values, religious values, no surprise coming from her camp. And then Derek Sloan talking about not just having answers to economic questions, but also talking about having answers to questions about homelessness, about the opioid addiction problem in this country. And so it was interesting that perhaps the less obvious answers came from the less obvious, less mainstream candidates.
Yes, go ahead.
On the environment, watching those two debates, you do get the impression that the Conservatives, or at least those candidates, are hoping for a replay of what happened to climate change and the environment after the 2008 global financial crisis, i.e. the crisis chased off climate change from the radar and led to Stephen Harper's majority government a few years later. So it's hard to win, as others could testify, the Conservative leadership at this juncture with an aggressive climate change policy. But I think they're giving themselves a pass on that, in large part because they believe the pandemic has changed the focus, and that if in an election in a year and a half, it will be easier for them to get a pass from voters without being strong on climate change. That could be a very wrong gamble, but it sounds like that.
Yeah. I only have 2 minutes left. Obviously, this was a debate for members, for the base, between one another. But while you were watching it, was there anyone there you thought, oh, this person could take on Justin Trudeau, could take on Mr. Blanchet or Mr. Singh, could be a real competitor in a federal race? Andrew, I'll make you start first.
I think either MacKay or O'Toole will be credible. I think they are both major advances on Scheer in terms of coming across as relatable and relatively normal. Neither of them would impress you with their huge vision for the country, for having a particularly strong advocates for how they would change policies in the country. But they come across as moderate, responsible, likable people.
Althea, about 30 seconds on that same one.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. One thing that struck me the last 2 days is I feel like Peter MacKay is almost like the Justin Trudeau in 2012 when he was running for the leadership then. Yeah. He's kind of like this empty vessel in which you could put whatever policies the party decides to come up with, or strategic advisors. But he seemed very confident and in control. And frankly, for a campaign that we have mocked and criticized for the past few months, he showed himself to speak quite well in French, or at least a lot better than we expected. Yep. And he performed a lot better than we expected.
Chantal, same to you.
I think it's an either-or thing. I don't think that most Conservative members in the Conservative mainstream would be angry and would leave if one or the other is defeated. There's no Maxime Bernier wing in the contest. Whether either is really impressive, it's really hard to tell at this early juncture. But I think they have two candidates that would look more credible, I agree, than Andrew Scheer did, who brought no cabinet experience, very little of that to the table, and it really showed.
All right, let's talk about another big event this week, a busy week actually politically. After a 4-year campaign, Canada lost its bid for a temporary seat on the UN Security Council this week. Norway and Ireland won the 2 available seats. The Prime Minister spoke about that loss today. Here's some of what he said.
Getting this seat was never an end in itself. but rather a means to an end, a means to ensure that our voice was heard and that our values upheld on the world stage. The bid was certainly one way to achieve this, but it's far from the only way. Moving forward, Canadians can count on us to keep working with our partners to make progress internationally on issues that matter to them.
I'm going to start with Andrew because I saw him tweeting before we did this about how people like to interpret these things any way that suits them, essentially, ideologically, but it's hard to know. So was the loss, I guess, a surprise to you in any way here, Andrew?
I didn't have any strong expectation one way or the other. It was certainly a blow to the Trudeau government, less so, I think, to the country as a whole. It's a blow to the government mostly because they'd made such a big deal of it last time when the Harper government tried and failed. And the Liberals made a great show of preening and telling the world how much better they would do. So when, in fact, it's not enough for either them or Canada just to show up, I suppose there's lessons to be learned from that. But yes, people are a little too quick to say, well, it's because, if you're on the left, because we're too pro-Israel. If you're on the right, it's because you think we've been too much virtue signaling or what have you. The fact of the matter is we don't really know. And what we do know from past experience is some of these campaigns can get rather grubby. So maybe, we'll find out in the fullness of time that it's because we didn't bribe the right delegates in the right way.
Chantal, is there a message there or a lesson for the Prime Minister or for the government?
I think there is a message for the Prime Minister and for his inner circle, and it doesn't have anything to do with all the otherwise worthwhile analysis about Canada's place in the world and why this happened. But it goes to political judgment and acumen. Why you would double down and give this such a high profile in the middle of a pandemic when the government is in a minority position, unless you have a perception of yourselves and the Prime Minister that is completely divorced or largely divorced from the perception of the Prime Minister and Canada abroad, is a huge judgment question. It suggests that you do not see yourself, or in this case the Prime Ministers, as others see you. And I believe that's a problem. I didn't know or didn't think one way or the other whether Canada would win, but I think most Canadians, who, given the high profile and the political capital that the Prime Minister publicly put on the table on this bid, expected Canada to put up more of a fight than to lose on the first ballot and in the end be defeated in a way that is much worse than Stephen Harper's defeat in the same game a few years ago.
I wonder, though, Althea, if the people around Justin Trudeau and the Prime Minister himself at one point did think or did actually have the worldwide cachet that they thought would get them to this point and lost it and didn't make that connection, as Chantal's talking about there.
I think actually that's exactly what happened. I would have been shocked, frankly, if the Prime Minister had decided to give up the UN bid, having announced personally, I believe for the very first time, that we had actually had a Prime Minister who came out and announced that this was going to be something that government was going to pursue because we were in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, what about the commitments that Canada has made to all those other countries? Perhaps vote swaps that have happened because suddenly we decide that there's a pandemic and we need to everybody's complete 100% efforts to focus domestically, and we can't pursue other agendas because we want a UN Security Council seat. I think that the major problem that the Liberals made is that they bought their own press. When 2006 announcement was made, Justin Trudeau was at the height of his popularity. He was over 60% in the polls. He was the darling of international media. He'd come out from Davos. He had Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General at the time, in Ottawa. He was riding high. And I think the Liberals really wanted to be able to say that they were starkly different than Stephen Harper, and where Stephen Harper had failed, Justin Trudeau would succeed. And then Donald Trump got elected, and the Foreign Affairs Minister, after Stephen Zion, Chrystia Freeland, seemed to have zero interest in pursuing the UN Security Council seat. And basically until François-Philippe Champagne and the NAFTA deal was done, then we kind of like, oh yeah, and we decided to do this thing. But we never actually fully committed. We said we were going to go big on peacekeeping, aside from the Mali mission that was just a few months. And then we said, hey, we're actually not going to stay, even though the UN is asking us. We didn't really go big on the commitment. And the Prime Minister is right when he says that we entered this race several years too late, and that was their decision. They could have picked another slot where the candidates had not already pronounced themselves to fill those 2 slots. Who wants to go against Norway? I mean, if the UN had a poster child, it would be Norway.
Yeah, and even Ireland, very competitive too. Chantal, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, but 2 points. If the people around Justin Trudeau don't know that Justin Trudeau in 2015 is not Justin Trudeau in 2020, they must have missed last fall's election. And the message that Canadians themselves sent that Prime Minister. So first point. The second point, if it looks like a lost battle, why would you put the Prime Minister on the line in the way that they did consistently over the past 3 months? They could have downplayed it by having François-Philippe Champagne be the main player on this. I don't remember Jean Chrétien going out on a limb and sending us press releases in the middle of a less crisis period saying, or right after the referendum, how would you have felt if you'd gotten a bunch of press releases that says the country is on the brink, Jean Chrétien talked this morning to this and that, and every single day they played up the Trudeau card. They believed it was their only card, but it does damage the Prime Minister.
Yeah, but I wonder, and this takes me to Andrew's column this week. I mean, it does seem as though they do maybe have some issues around what is actually happening, given the way they're dealing with Parliament, given the reluctance to give us any sort of fiscal update. I mean, is this stuff all sort of interconnected, Andrew? This inability maybe to, or unwillingness to govern as though they're in a minority situation?
It's certainly true that governments over time can get disconnected, that people within the Prime Minister's office can get insulated in a bubble, if you will. And that may be what's happening here. I'm less concerned with the political ramifications, although I think Chantal's point is very well taken on that, than the possible policy connections, which is to what extent has the tail been wagging the dog here? To what extent has the government been making policy with a view to trying to achieve that UN Security Council seat, rather than making policy for the sake of policy and then letting the chips fall where they may in terms of the Security Council? I mean, there's a lot of critiques you can make of Canadian. A lot of critiques you can make of Canadian foreign policy, but they stand or fall independent of whether or not we win the Security Council seat.
So I just want to do one more round on whether, I mean, I remember in 2010 how the Liberals reveled in Stephen Harper's loss, and so to that end, some Conservatives are doing that certainly again today. But should we not be at a place in this country where a bid for the UN, or whatever we decide to make a bid for, is done in a non-partisan place, or am I oh, Chantal's already laughing at me. But I mean, you would think that there could be, as there was with NAFTA or other things, some sort of Team Canada approach, and it just doesn't seem like it's even on the table as a thing. Chantal, you can go first because your eyes rolled the fastest, then Althea.
We still have a capacity to work together, but interestingly enough, it has been better internally, as in the NAFTA negotiations or in this COVID crisis, than it has been on the international stage. And I do believe that what you talk about, which sounds nice in theory, died in 2010 when everyone dumped on Stephen Harper for not getting that seat. And the Liberals, human nature is human nature. At some point, the Liberals spent 10 years telling Canadians that this was all Stephen Harper's fault and all would be great once they were back, as if their sheer presence was enough. So I don't think going forward that it's going to be easy to have this kind of Team Canada approach to those kind of issues, because the fault line between the belief in multilateralism that the Liberals use as a fundamental creed is no longer shared in the same way by the Conservatives.
Yeah, that's fair. Althea, your thoughts on that?
A few things. One, I think the reason that not only did the Liberals gloat when Stephen Harper failed to win a bid, but the Conservatives also tried to spin the win as a plus. Because we have a principles foreign policy, because we didn't want to curry favors with those dictators in Africa, that's why we lost. And the Liberals, when they came out and they said they wanted to do this, they thought they didn't need the Conservatives or anybody else, frankly, and that this was going to be that point of demarcation between the Trudeau Liberals and the Harper Conservatives. And they didn't bring them on side in the same way that they really did actually feel they needed them on NAFTA. They didn't want to have any criticisms at home. They wanted to speak from a unified voice, which would make them stronger in Washington. Now, this is not my original thought. Adam Chatnick, who's actually written a book on Canada, the UN Security Council, makes this point that actually Canada is the only G7 country, a Western country, where this bid is a political bid, and that the country does not speak with a unified voice. And I do think that it hampers our effort, and maybe in the next decade, when we ask for another Security Council seat, the government of the day will seek the opposition's efforts, perhaps even help in trying to pitch Canada as a worthy participant at the UN Security Council.
All good points. Andrew, last word to you on that.
There's a legitimate question of principle as to whether or not we should be making such a priority of trying to win a Security Council seat. I don't happen to think it's worth the game to begin with. As a matter of politics, you'd be asking a lot of the Tories not to take a free kick after what the Liberals did to them the first time. I would suggest the way out of this is for both parties to stop trying to claim that Canada or Canadian values are their exclusive property. And I'll assign blame, I'm not saying it's equal between the two of them. But as long as that's going to go on, as long as people are going to say things like Canada's back as if it had been away, then you're going to be politicizing what ought to be perhaps a nonpartisan matter.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good conversation. Appreciate it.